Marku versus Ryan Charlton. Let's talk about the fight. Well, I decided to go with Marku to win this thing.
He did.
But he seems to have done so by the skin of his teeth. This is a fight where Florian Marku had to pick himself up off the canvas.
In the 6th round.
Strange as this might sound, Ryan Charlton, in some ways, was fighting a better fight than Florian Marku with a more cohesive game plan, more fluid.
Just that Ryan took more hard shots.
But he did seem to have a bit of a better strategy than Marku, in spite of Marku having won the fight. Marku, who
I don't know.
switched off from orthodox to southpaw several times throughout the course of the match, though why he did it, I'm not completely sure.
Really wasn't a concentrated effort.
I don't really know what Florian Marku's game plan was, assuming he even had one, aside from, throwing punches at the guy opposite the ring.
Yeah.
But the point and purpose of his movements up until the point that the fight was stopped by Ryan Charlton's corner, it did seem a bit confusing.
A lot of pointless movement.
A lot of laying on the ropes and allowing Ryan Charlton to let off shots, giving Ryan Charlton the appearance of the ring general for some portion of this match. I think that if Florian Marku won this fight, he won this fight through strength of arms, which is what I felt he brought to the table, which is what led me to believe he can win this thing more or less, that he is the bigger puncher of these two guys.
Though not much else. Landed some really good uppercuts.
He's a strong puncher, this guy. It's just that in terms of fluidity, in terms of strategy and technique, Florian Marku is lacking in certain areas. Ryan Charlton actually had the look of the better boxer, in spite of Ryan Charlton having lost the fight.
I feel like Florian Marku got lucky.
It was Ryan Charlton's corner that threw in the towel, after all, so I've no complaints as far as how the fight ended. I mean, I don't think anyone can.
Can't complain.
It was Ryan Charlton's corner that decided that Ryan had had enough. He was taking a lot of clean shots, trying to stay off the line, but still taking punishment in the process of it.
Both his eyes were swollen shut.
From the end of the 7th round, going into the 8th, that's when Ryan started taking heavy shots. That's when he started coming under heavy fire. If his corner decided to throw the towel, that would have been it. That in spite of fighting a more fluid fight and a more cohesive fight than Florian Marku, the guy's taking too much punishment. He's taking too many hard shots. Perhaps the swelling in both eyes is impairing his vision, and if this thing goes on, he could suffer irreparable damage because he's trying to stay off the line, but he's still getting clipped. I feel like Florian Marku got lucky here. I feel like his power is ultimately what bailed him out. His power as opposed to his boxing.
It's a good win for Florian.
Who advances to a professional record of 8 wins, no losses with 1 draw. This is one of those instances where even though the guy secured the W, it wasn't a good advertisement for him. That if Florian finds himself so confronted with a Conor Ben, well, I don't think he'd have the luck with Conor that he just had with Ryan. Then come to the main event of that same card, the long-awaited, long-anticipated fight between Josh Kelly and David Avanesyan. It seems that the chickens have finally come home to roost for Josh. This was foretold by many, that Josh, he's got a lot of flash, but not a lot of substance.
David fucked him up.
I decided to give Josh the benefit of the doubt ahead of this fight. I decided to go with Josh Kelly to win on points.
And that's not what happened.
I want to say that Josh Kelly started this fight well enough. I gave Josh Kelly the first round. You could have arguably given David Avanesyan the second round, though it did look like a swing round. I swung it David Avanesyan's way. Rounds 3 and 4 I gave to Josh Kelly, but it was in round 4 that you started noticing the fight's getting away from Josh. Round 5 definitely had to go to David Avanesyan, who was roughing young Josh Kelly up at that point. At the time the fight was stopped, my scorecard, I had Josh Kelly 3 rounds to 2.
He was up.
But it was quite clear by then what direction this fight was going, what direction it had gone. That cut in the back of Josh Kelly's head,
I don't know if it had a role to play.
though it could have. I mean, losing that much blood in the course of a professional boxing match, so early in the match, as the fighter's adrenaline is pumping,
They never fully got that thing under control.
you have to wonder that didn't have some role to play. You have to wonder that cut on the back of Josh Kelly's head didn't have something to do with what happened, though ultimately, this loss that Josh Kelly suffered at the hands of David Avanesyan was foretold long before the fight took place. I mean, there were a lot of people that were never really convinced that Josh Kelly could go to, that next level. I'm not in a hurry to criticize Josh because, Josh Kelly ahead of this fight, what was he, 10-0? That was his professional record. He had a professional record of 10 wins and no losses. This was just his 11th professional fight. It's very easy. It's very cheap to criticize Josh for losing to someone like David Avanesyan without adding context to the conversation that he was facing a guy like David Avanesyan in what was only his 11th professional fight. You have to ask yourself, would a lot of these guys' sweethearts in the welterweight division, would they have fared any better with a fighter like David Avanesyan if that's the kind of guy that they were fighting in only their 11th professional fight? Josh Kelly stepped up in competition, and perhaps he stepped up too soon, at a time when he could have just as easily stayed on the bring-along process the way many fighters have, the way many fighters often still do. A fighter like Jared Boots Ennis comes to mind almost immediately because this is an unbeaten fighter the way that Josh Kelly was an unbeaten fighter, but a fighter like Jared Boots Ennis, this guy's got 26 professional fights. That's 2 times the fights that Josh Kelly has, yet this is a fighter that has yet to face the likes of a David Avanesyan. I think about that on the heels of Josh Kelly's loss, and I find it difficult to give Josh Kelly any guff, any flack, any static. Yeah, he lost the fight to David Avanesyan.
But at least he stepped up.
It's a situation to where I can't fault Josh Kelly for not being on the split pea and applesauce diet that many other fighters are on, because that's essentially what happened here. He stepped up in competition, and hindsight being 2020, he stepped up too soon. He wasn't ready for David.
And while a lot of people saw this coming,
from the moment that these two guys' names became synonymous with each other, on the heels of the Ray Robinson fight, on the heels of the Ranowski fight, 2 fights where Josh Kelly didn't look all that impressive. In spite of that, we are talking about a fighter who only had 10 professional fights. This was his 11th, and David Avanesyan is not the kind of guy that most other fighters are fighting in only their 11th professional fight. That's just the truth of it. But if you're going to tell the story, tell the whole story, why don't you? David Avanesyan picked apart Josh Kelly. I think the body work had a lot to do with it.
It did.
David Avanesyan made a conscious investment to go downstairs on Josh. Josh, who's a very athletic fighter, likes to use his legs, likes to use the ring. Going to the body was a sound investment on David Avanesyan's part, and it paid dividends quite early.
Fight only lasted 6 rounds.
Between the cut and going to Josh Kelly's breadbasket, that might have sapped what energy reserves young Josh Kelly, who was stepping up in competition, that might have sapped what energy reserves Josh might have had. In hindsight, you could almost say that David Avanesyan picked apart Josh Kelly with minimal effort. I mean,
that it really didn't take much.
Can Josh Kelly bounce back from this? I really don't know. The silver lining is that Josh is only 26 years old. He's only got 10 professional fights. He still is in the earlier stages of his career. Lots of fighters, some more legendary than others, suffered losses, even earlier than Josh just did, in their careers. I mean, if nothing else, they're really going to have to take their foot off the gas with this kid once he returns.
Unless they want him to end up like Luke Campbell.
Because Josh, much like Luke, is an Olympian, and I have no doubts it is Josh's Olympic pedigree that led the matchmakers to put him in this situation in a face-fucking place. But, this ain't the amateurs. This is the pros.
These ain't 3-round fights you're fighting in.
And we see this a lot with these Olympic upstarts, these guys that come from solid amateur backgrounds. They try to fast-track them through the professional ranks, and sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't.
Didn't work out for Josh.
Congratulations to David Avanesyan for continuing to be the rough and rugged fighter he's known for being. As far as Josh, well, there are serious question marks hanging over his head now, though ultimately, his career's not over. Not yet. We then come to what was yesterday's main course, the fight that I have no doubts many of us were waiting for, the fight that many of us were waiting to see, the long-anticipated fight between the then reigning WBC super featherweight champion Miguel Berchelt and the
exemplary,
very courageous Oscar Valdez, who, in hindsight, I think put on a clinic. If I had to wrap my mind around what Oscar Valdez did to Miguel Berchelt, he systematically broke this guy down in a way that I didn't anticipate, and if I'm being honest, I don't think most people anticipated.
Spare me the Monday morning quarterbacks.
I mean, from the moment that this fight even became a talking point, from the moment that this fight even became a thing, Oscar Valdez was the perceived underdog, that he was biting off more than he could chew, that the guy who got into an all-out war with Scott Quigg and was dropped by Adam Lopez, surely this guy doesn't stand much of a chance against Miguel Berchelt.
He's too big. He's too strong.
I'm not even going to pretend that I wasn't of this same school of thought, because I was. I had Miguel Berchelt winning this thing, and I had Miguel Berchelt winning this thing by way of knockout, and that is not what happened.
I bet Sulem Urbina $50,000 that's what was going to happen.
Thankfully, Sulem Urbina decided to let me off the hook. If I have to wrap my mind around what it was that Oscar did that led to this sensational knockout, this sensational victory.
The jab.
From the moment that the fight started, the jab of Oscar Valdez, the lead hand, his usage of it,
it broke Miguel Berchelt's rhythm.
Broke his stride and stopped Miguel Berchelt in his tracks that whenever Miguel Berchelt would attempt to stalk Oscar Valdez, to try to pin that guy down to start landing hard shots, he'd get touched with a jab.
And this kept happening.
That for a fighter like Miguel Berchelt, whose offense is in many ways his defense, that his brand of defense is unloading so much heavy artillery, so much heavy firepower, that the other guy stops throwing.
That's Miguel Berchelt's defense.
That's what it has been up until this point. For a guy like that, who's used to getting a lot of respect from his opponents, who's used to getting his opponents to keep their hands in their pockets, keep their guns holstered, Oscar put him in a very awkward situation because before Miguel Berchelt even got to unload that heavy artillery, he was met with jabs consistently by Oscar Valdez that interrupted his stride, interrupted his offense, his rhythm. He couldn't get anything going.
That exposed Miguel's fundamental flaws.
That under normal circumstances, Miguel Berchelt, being the heavy puncher that he is, the heavy puncher that uses his offense as defense, normally he doesn't have to worry about moving his head and staying off the line.
Normally his opponents don't want to throw.
Normally he gets a lot more respect from his opponents than what he got from Oscar Valdez last night. Oscar, who quite effectively timed him with that lead hand, kept touching him with it, kept breaking his rhythm.
Takes a step forward and gets popped in the face.
There are many ways to effectively use the lead hand, many ways to employ the jab. Oscar's jab wasn't used as a key to get inside on Miguel Berchelt. Rather, it was used as a trip hammer
to nail him at the front door.
That, in unison with Oscar's strategic clinching, that whenever Miguel Berchelt thought he could get anything going, Oscar would tie him up,
tire him out,
prostrate him whilst still breaking his rhythm, still breaking his stride. This led to what was a very long night for Miguel Berchelt, and I have to say that the plan was fluid, the plan was effective, but that plan, that course of action, and this fight working out the way that it did, really is not what I expected. I have to take my hat off to Oscar Valdez for putting on a clinic. I don't think it was at all a good omen ahead of the fight that Miguel Berchelt needed help getting off the scale, that perhaps the guy had tried to make 130 pounds one time too many. In hindsight, I think that's important because that has everything to do with Miguel Berchelt's ability to take a punch. And that is in no way, shape, or form intended to excuse Miguel Berchelt for having lost the fight or diminish Oscar Valdez for securing the W, securing the victory. But it was noticeable at the weigh-in that Miguel Berchelt immediately rushed
to chow down on some peaches.
That was noticeable. That was noteworthy, though. Ultimately, I didn't lose much sleep over that. I still thought Miguel Berchelt was going to win this thing, and I was wrong. Between the strategic jab and the strategic clinching from Oscar Valdez, that in unison with Oscar's movement, that when he wasn't snapping Miguel Berchelt's head back with the lead hand, he was using the ring, using it to his advantage, preventing Miguel Berchelt from planting his feet and letting off hard shots, letting off bombs. The constant movement of Oscar Valdez likely came at the expenditure of energy of both of the fighters. But Miguel was the one sustaining punishment. Miguel was the one getting his head snapped back. Miguel was the one who hit the canvas more than once.
Miguel is the one who got figured out.
If he can be timed with the lead hand, Miguel doesn't have the natural instincts to simply stay off the line. Move your head.
Because normally he doesn't have to.
I think that was his ultimate undoing. Many of us were anticipating an all-out war between Miguel and Oscar, and that's not necessarily what we got. What we got from Oscar was a lot of boxing, a lot of sharpshooting.
It was a lot more cerebral than what I expected.
In August of 2018, approximately 2 years ago, news broke that Oscar Valdez had parted ways with his old trainer, Manny Robles, and enlisted the aid of Eddie Reynoso.
Yeah, I remember.
And since then, I wondered if Oscar had spent enough time under Eddie Reynoso's wing to where he would start improving as a fighter, because, the Scott Quigg fight, it looked like the kind of fight that takes years off of a fighter's career. It looked like the kind of fight to where the guy might be damaged goods henceforth.
He hired Eddie Reynoso after that fight.
He had 4 fights since then, but I wasn't impressed with what I was seeing from Oscar. Least of all in the Adam Lopez fight, where Oscar hit the deck, where Oscar had to pick himself up off the canvas in order to secure the W. Ahead of this Berchelt fight, I wondered,
has he improved enough?
Would having Eddie Reynoso in his corner make any difference at all for Oscar Valdez? And it seems like it did.
Because this fight wasn't a shootout.
And while that is what everyone was expecting, because Oscar Valdez himself is known as an action fighter, an action guy, an artillery guy, while most of us thought that this was going to be an all-out war, what this turned out to be was
testament to Oscar's boxing.
Oscar didn't win this fight through strength of arms. He won this fight through precision punching and movement, through strategy.
Even a big left hand that he landed on Miguel.
Wasn't a testament to Oscar just letting his hands go, bombs away. By that time, Oscar had already systematically broken down Miguel Berchelt. Miguel Berchelt, whose energy reserves were already so spent, at that point he's just stumbling forward, trying to land a punch, and he walks into a big left hand. Yet another precision punch from Oscar Valdez. A peach of a left hand. How else can we reconcile how Oscar looked against Scott Quigg, how Oscar looked against Adam Lopez? How else can we reconcile this but then to say that, he has improved since then? That's the only way you can make it make sense. And what has happened since that time? Eddie Reynoso. That's what happened. Oscar would be the second fighter in recent memory that sacked Manny Robles for the tutelage of Eddie Reynoso. Andy Ruiz, not that long ago, he basically did the same thing. He's over there with Eddie Reynoso as we speak in the process of gearing his comeback.
Oscar got better.
How else can you explain Oscar Valdez going life or death with Scott Quigg at 126 pounds, getting dropped by a relatively unproven Adam Lopez? How else can you explain Oscar looking the way that he looked against those fighters and looking the way that he just looked against Miguel Berchelt? Miguel Berchelt was perceived as a much bigger threat to Oscar than those two guys.
Oscar got better.